Welcome to What's the Scenario with PLRB, where we explore claims and coverage scenarios relevant to insurance professionals. I'm Alicia Watley.
I'm Tim Havler.
And I'm Mike Broad.
All right, Tim, what's the scenario?
Insured is a charitable organization. Times were tough. Fundraising was stagnant. The insured was looking to save money, so they asked their insurance company if they could lower their premiums by canceling their coverage only for hurricanes. The underwriters agreed and drafted a one-page endorsement with an exclusion for named storms. Sure enough, the insured got hit with a hurricane the very next month. They submitted a claim anyways, now stating they don't see any named storm exclusion in their policy. The adjuster looks at it but can't find it either. It turns out the insurer forgot to include the endorsement in the policy bundle, but still there are documented conversations that the insured wanted to cancel their hurricane coverage, and they did get lower premiums. And the insured doesn't really even deny that. So who wins this one?
Nobody wins, Tim. Nobody wins.
Once it goes to litigation, wins.
Right.
I'm
Well,
sure.
Everyone's always looking for loopholes, and
Right.
if one approaches you, do you take it or not?
Well, I'm sure the three of us have never made a dumb mistake in our lives, but this kind of thing
Never.
does happen, actually, with relative frequency. Maybe not to this extent, but little things in the policy that were an oversight.
All right, so let's talk about legal doctrines. Legal doctrine number 1. Ambiguities are construed against the insurance company.
Yep, this is the familiar one. Probably most adjusters have heard this one. Over the years, ambiguities are construed against the insurance company. Why? Because the insurance company drafted the policy, or at least had a chance to change it before they issued it. So if they put in something that isn't very clear, and that could kind of go one way or the other, let's just say courts aren't going to do you a whole lot of favors then in interpreting that for you, because again, you had the chance to be more clear. So that would be, like you said, Alicia, legal doctrine number 1. But here, I would say they're probably just within the 4 corners of the policy, really no ambiguities. It says windstorm is covered. There's no exclusions for hurricanes. That seems pretty clear to me. So the dispute here is coming from outside of the policy.
Because even, if you look at, like you said, the 4 corners of the contract or whatever your state looks at contracts, still, this contract, at least allegedly yet, we don't think had that endorsement attached to it. So if the contract is silent as to that endorsement that was supposed to limit coverage for named storms, it's not there. It ain't in the contract, Tim. How do you use it to deny a claim?
Well, I guess we'd have to go outside of the contract. But that's hard to do because let's look at legal doctrine number 2. I will colloquially refer to it as the contract says what the contract says, period. This is also known as the Parole Evidence rule to lawyers. The idea here is that when you sign on the dotted line, you have a certain responsibility to make sure things are correct in there. And if we let everyone second guess every contract and say, we didn't mean that, we talked about this, it would be difficult in courts. So there is a rule, again, the parole evidence rule, that courts will not even allow evidence to be presented that something was meant to be different outside of the written contract. I just had this simple example written down. I was trying to relate this to you, Alicia. I have no idea if this is something that actually would happen, but you can tell me. So you're planning a claims conference and you're on the phone, you're negotiating, you're working things out, and the person tells you, we'll throw in a 50% discount on all the coffee. All your coffee expenses are half
Nice.
off. And you say, sounds good, we'll take that. They say, all right, don't worry, we'll add it to the contract. You just go ahead and we'll email it to you and you sign it, and you get it and you sign it. And then 2 months later, they charge you full price for that coffee. And you said, you promised me half price on coffee. They said, oh, sorry, I don't remember that. And it's not in the contract. According to the parole evidence rule, you can't even present that as evidence in the court, your oral conversation. Now you can tell me.
Which is why everything's done with addendums. Yeah, emails and stuff like that. Even if we've talked about it, it's like, yeah, can we get that in writing, please?
Yes.
Just so I have a record
Right,
of
and
it.
that's why.
Especially if it's 50% off coffee with all the coffee that our attendees drink. Yes.
And me, yes,
I'm
you got that right.
guilty as charged at those conferences.
We all are. So yeah, I'm a fan of addendums to contracts, just so that contract says what it says as well.
Right. And now I'm going to tell you the total opposite of what I just said when I get to legal doctrine number 3. Colloquially, it's so obvious the insured agreed to cancel the hurricane. Not even a coverage, and not even the insured denies this. It just seems so unfair. You just get that feeling that this is not right. So, courts sit in both.
Especially with the.
Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, Tim, but yeah, I mean, you got the premium thing too. That all of a sudden your premiums went down substantially.
Right.
The insured got the benefit of that. Well, what was that all about if it wasn't about this named storm?
Exactly. So courts, we say they sit in both law and equity, which is another way of saying they follow rules, but then they also rule equitably, which means they'll take a step back and look at the whole situation. And if something isn't quite coming up right, then they can rule on equitable principles, which is based more on a fundamental sense of fairness. So they have this exception to the parole evidence rule, which is if there was a mutual mistake in the contract where both parties agreed to something and then the writing is not accurately reflecting what they agreed to, then many courts will reform the contract to accurately reflect that original intent. So in our claim, there was a definite and clear oral agreement we can point to that there was not supposed to be hurricane coverage. And that would be a good argument to make when you go to court on this.
Especially if the insured is agreeing as well, saying, yeah, I thought that was our intent and we got a premium reduction. But Tim, it's so confusing because at first we're saying a contract's a contract, period, I believe you said. And now you're saying, well, we can reform it, even though, so is a contract, period, or can we reform a contract to meet the will or the agreement of the parties that were involved? Which is it, sir?
Yes, always confusing. Our rules seem to be contradicting each other pretty badly.
Right.
And this is where we got to get out of, and as a former engineer, I do this all the time, which is I want the flow chart of I can follow this rule and this rule and this rule and this rule. That's not necessarily how it works in the law. A lot of times you got to take a step back, think more about in stories, about in, again, fundamental sense of fairness, and courts absolutely will make exceptions to their own doctrines when they choose, basically. So the final answer really is, what can one side or the other convince a judge or a jury in this one? Now, this claim, it sounds kind of exaggerated because you think no one would make this mistake. It's based pretty closely on a recent Florida case, Shiloh Christian Center versus Aspen Specialty. This went up to the federal appellate court, and the court held they went with more of the hard nose. A contract is a contract is a contract, and therefore this contract says there's coverage for hurricanes, and they gave the insured coverage, even though there was pretty good evidence that the insured did not intend to keep that coverage. So, and then if you read the whole opinion, in the very first paragraph, the court kind of sets the stage and it refers to the insurance company as a billion-dollar insurance conglomerate. So you maybe get a sense of where they were going with that. If there's, hypothetically, let's reverse this. Let's say instead of forgetting an exclusion, the insurance company accidentally put in an extra exclusion. Do you think the court would be upholding that one against the insured just because it's in the contract?
Of course
I
not.
don't think so. I highly doubt it. I think a contract is a contract is a contract would be overridden by
Period.
some other doctrine. So the lesson here
Period. Yes.
is the insurance company isn't under an increased burden to dot its I's and cross its T's and make sure everything is in good order.
So say I get like the new coverage and I want to scribble on here, no hurricane coverage. You know, is that if I put it on the application before everything is signed, can that still go through?
Right. So if someone just writes something on the application, it's not necessarily in the policy, but it is on the application. The rules for applications, we can look at them. It's fair game. It's attached to the policy, but only if we're trying to get to the party's intent. But if there is a direct conflict, the policy typically controls. So in this claim, if that happened, I think we'd still end up going back to, if the court chooses to go with the party's intent, they're going to go that way. If the court chooses to go with the contract as written, they're going to go that way. Yeah.
So let me throw one more curveball at you, Tim. All right. Let's say the adjuster that was handling the claim, she heard that part and said, can't find the exclusion. I'm going to pay the claim because there was a hurricane. Then gets QA audited later, and somebody else says, look here. I found that named storm exclusion, and it applied to the policy. So the adjuster paid it even though that endorsement was attached and was there. She just didn't see it. A couple months later down the road, the insurance company going to get their money back? What's going to happen in that scenario, sir?
Did that ever happen that you can recall in your adjusting career? Not necessarily you.
Right. I never made a mistake like that. But yes, it did happen at times, sir. And I think there's something that it comes down to detrimental reliance. Does that sound familiar?
Very familiar. So as a general rule, I would say the adjuster's mistake can't create coverage where none existed in the first place. But there are two important exceptions: waiver and estoppel, which basically just means if the insurance company waives one of their rights or leads the insured to believe something, then it's hard to go back on that. So where you're going there with the detrimental reliance is if the insured took that payment and they did something with it. Yeah, say they did the repairs or they put something, then it's going to be really hard to get that money back because they relied on having that money into the future and spent it, and they spent it well. They made the repairs. Now, if they didn't do anything with it, say it's still just sitting in their bank account, you could argue no harm, no foul. There was never coverage. We made a mistake. We want that back. You're on thin ice. You could try for it, but again, that I think would be a risk.
So are they getting the money back or not? I'm not just kidding.
How bad do you want that money?
So no money back. So I have a weird question. So the policy was saying something about a named hurricane. Are all hurricanes named? And would there be a loophole in that?
Oh, good question. I would like to talk to Andrew, our weather person, about this.
I know one year they ran out of alphabet letters, so they started using weird, this is Hurricane Omega something or other. I would argue, Tim, that's not a real name. Nobody out there is named Omega 57.2. So
do you know everyone in the world?
That's right. Elon Musk may have one of his kids named Omega 3.875.
I always feel bad for the people who have the same name as a real bad hurricane that year.
We have someone on staff who had the same name of a real bad hurricane in 2017.
Oh, Hurricane Maria? And anyone who was named Katrina prior to 2008. You always got that.
They went to the courthouse and made a change really quick. No, I'm just Cat.
Yeah.
That didn't work either because catastrophe.
No,
All
just
right,
add an E and you'll be Katerina.
there you go. Ooh.
All right, Tim, so what can we take away from today's scenario?
To recap, underwriting forgot to put an exclusion into the policy bundle, even though it's clear it was supposed to be in there and the policyholder knew it too. The policyholder can try to argue that the contract is the contract, and the written contract says there's coverage. The insurance company
Period.
has a good counter argument that the intent of both sides was so clearly to have that exclusion in the policy. But at least one court recently, applying Florida law, dismissed that argument, which is a good example of courts looking unfavorably on mistakes or oversights made by insurers. So it's always best for insurers to be as precise and accurate as possible. Mike, do we have any PLRB resources that might be relevant to today's topic that you are aware of?
I do. I'm sure, Tim, we got stuff on waiver, estoppel. I'm sure out there that we would have. Of course, we got tons of stuff on hurricanes and damage and appraisal and all the other stuff that can come out of hurricanes. So we have a plethora of wonderful information at plrb.org. And Alicia, I'm sure we can put those in the show notes, right?
Yes, we can definitely put those in the show notes. In the show notes, you can always find a recap of the key points of this episode, links to our social media, and information on how to submit your own adjuster story. We would love to hear from you. So if you've got a story you'd like us to cover here on What's the Scenario with PLRB, send us an email, and we hope to hear from a lot of you. Don't forget, also subscribe and rate us on whatever platform you're listening to What's the Scenario on, and we'll see you all next time.
And of course, we want 5 stars, right, Alicia?
Please.
Yay.
All right. Thanks, guys.
See
Bye.
you, everyone.
The views and opinions expressed in this resource are those of the individual speaker and not necessarily those of the Property and Liability Resource Bureau, its membership, or any organization with which the presenter is employed or affiliated. The information, ideas, and opinions are presented as information only and not as legal advice or offers of representation. Individual policy language and state laws vary, and listeners should rely on guidance from their companies and counsel as appropriate.